Imagine being 10 years old, standing in the doorway, watching your father weep at the kitchen table. He didn't just lose a job today. He lost the savings, the house, and the future. For the greatest generation, the Great Depression wasn't a history lesson. It was the furniture of childhood. You learned before you could read that the world owed you absolutely nothing, not even dinner. You watched your mother slice a single loaf of bread so thin it looked like lace. You wore your older brother's boots until your toes curled permanently against the hard, worn leather. You never asked for a new pair because you saw what more cost the people you loved. Then, just as you grew tall enough to work, the world demanded something else entirely from you. It handed you a rifle, put you on a boat, and asked you to save civilization. 18-year-olds stormed beaches in France while 19-year-olds flew bombers through flak over burning European cities. Those who stayed behind rationed sugar and worked assembly lines until their fingerprints were worn smooth. Extreme, shared adversity hardens a generation, not into cruelty, but into a quiet, unbreakable resilience. They didn't talk about trauma or feelings because in their world, feelings were an expensive luxury. You buried the fear and kept moving because there was a war to win and mouths to feed. Psychologists call it stoic pragmatism, but they just called it doing what had to be done. They believed complaining was pointless, and the only thing that mattered was your next useful action. This gave them a supernatural ability to endure uncertainty without ever letting anyone see them spiral. They could lose everything at dawn and start rebuilding by noon, asking only for a clear task. Then came the silent generation, born into a world that was already burning before they could walk. Your earliest memory is the taste of dust in your mouth and your mother boiling bones twice. If you lived in Oklahoma, you remember the sky turning black at noon, choking on Earth itself. You watched families pack their entire lives onto a truck, only to be turned back at the border. You learned early that silence was safer than questions because the adults had no answers either. Then you sat by the radio, tracking invisible armies in places you couldn't find on a map. By the time peace arrived, the lesson was carved into you. Keep your head down. The Red Scare taught you that the wrong word or the wrong friend could ruin everything. You saw teachers fired and actors blacklisted just for attending a meeting 10 years prior. When neighbors turn on neighbors, you learn to lock your door and your thoughts. For the silent generation, conformity wasn't a lack of imagination, it was a survival strategy. So you took the secure job, married young, and built a fortress of stability. While others would later raise their voices, you were the ones who kept the machinery running. Then came the baby boomers, 76 million strong, born into the loud, bright crash of victory. Your parents survived hell and wanted to give you heaven. A yard, a bike, a future. The world expanded in every direction, with new highways and televisions glowing in every living room. For the first time, the future looked like something to run toward, not just survive. But underneath the shiny chrome and suburban lawns, a long, dark shadow was stretching out. You practiced duck and cover drills, curling into a ball beneath your wooden school desk. You watched your parents freeze in front of the news, terrified by missiles in Cuba. You learned the world could end in a literal flash while you were eating dinner. Then the cracks appeared. Walter Cronkite taking off his glasses to tell you the president was dead. Vietnam wasn't like your father's war. There was no front line, just body counts on the evening news. It was the first time Americans ate dinner while watching their sons come home in bags. You realized for the first time that the institutions your parents worshipped might actually be lying. Yet, the generation that burned the rulebook eventually rewrote it entirely for themselves. The radicals became senators, and the hippies built the most aggressive consumer economy in history. They became experts at reinvention, pivoting seamlessly whenever the ground shifted beneath their feet. Then, there is Generation Jones, born too late for the party and too early for the technology. You didn't go to Woodstock. You watched it on a small TV while eating meatloaf. You were 10 years old, believing the older kids when they said the world was changing forever. Instead, you got Nixon resigning and a president lying to your face for 2 years. Watergate wasn't just politics. It was the moment you learned adults could not be trusted. By the time you turned 18, the war was over. But so was the prosperity. You got your driver's license just in time to sit in a gas line for 3 hours. You learned words like stagflation while watching mortgage rates climb to 18%. The boomers had already bought the cheap houses and locked in the secure pensions. You stood outside the window, watching the party end, wondering where your promise went. That's why they call you Jones, always jonesing for a life that was just out of reach. So you stopped waiting for a rescue that wasn't coming and just made it work. You became the bridge, the invisible glue, holding the optimists and the cynics together. And then came the latchkey kids, Generation X, who came home to an empty house. You walked into silence, made a sandwich, and figured out how to survive until 6 p.m. Your parents were at work, which meant you were the captain of a ghost ship. That silence wired something deep into your brain. Nobody is coming to solve this for you. It gave you a feral kind of freedom that children today will simply never understand. You rode your bike until your legs burned, crossing town lines just to see what was there. You drank warm water from a garden hose because going inside meant the magic was over. When the streetlights buzzed on, that was the only notification you ever received. If you made a mistake at 16, it stayed in the dark. There was no permanent digital record. You gotta be young, stupid, and private, figuring out who you were without an audience. But it wasn't just long summers. You were watching the world harden around you. You saw the stock market crash in '87 and the corporate downsizing that followed. You watched your parents sit at the kitchen table, voices low, spreading bills out like bad tarot cards. You didn't understand the economics, but you understood the fear in their eyes. By the time you entered the workforce, the job for life was already a corpse. You learned early that loyalty to a company was a one-way street. This didn't make you lazy. It made you aggressively clear-eyed and unsentimental. You worked hard, but you never confused your job with your family or your safety. You didn't expect a pension or a gold watch. You expected to earn your keep every single day. You kept your resume updated and your skills sharp because you knew safety was an illusion. Some call it cynicism, but you knew it was just the raw mechanics of survival. You realized the cavalry wasn't coming, so you learned to saddle your own horse. This self-reliance isn't coldness. It is the armor you forged in an empty afternoon. And here's the part nobody talks about, the secret thread that binds us all. We didn't just inherit our parents' eye color. We inherited their unspoken fears. The starvation of the 30s became the obsession with accumulation in the 80s. The silence of the Cold War mutated into the latchkey detachment of the 90s. Every generation is just a reaction to the trauma of the one before it. We swing like a pendulum, from scarcity to excess, from silence to noise. But beneath the labels and the dates, the human story remains exactly the same. It is the story of people trying to build a shelter in a storm they didn't create. The greatest generation gave us the ground we stand on, solid and paid for in blood. The silent generation built the walls, thick enough to keep the terrifying world out. The boomers put in the windows, demanding we look out at the possible future. Gen X put a lock on the door, reminding us that safety is a personal responsibility. We are not separate chapters in a history book. We are a single, continuous sentence. We carry the ghosts of the Depression and the echoes of Vietnam in our pockets. We do the best we can with the time and the trauma we are given. We survive, we adapt, and eventually, we pass the weight to someone new. It isn't always fair, and it isn't always pretty, but it is ours. And in the end, enduring together is the only victory that actually counts.